I could see invisible threads connecting soulmates, and my husband's led to someone else. Every person walked around with a faint golden line trailing from their chest, stretching across rooms, across cities, sometimes across the world, until it reached the one person their soul was bound to. I had seen them since I was 6 years old. I learned young to keep my mouth shut about it, because the one time I told my mother, she looked at me like I'd grown a second head. So I watched in silence. For 26 years, I saw the threads connecting strangers on the subway who would never speak to each other. I saw a thread running from my best friend Caroline straight to a man she hadn't met yet. And on my wedding day, standing at the altar in a dress I'd dreamed about since I was a girl, I looked at my husband Dean and followed the thread trailing from his chest. It didn't lead to me. It curved past my shoulder, out the chapel doors, down the street, and toward a future I couldn't see yet but somehow already knew I wasn't part of. I married him anyway. I told myself the threads were wrong sometimes. I told myself love was a choice, not a string. I told myself a lot of things over the next 3 years, while that golden line stayed exactly where it was, pointing somewhere I refused to look, until the night I finally followed it. My name is Vivian Hale. I'm 29 years old, and I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Portland where nothing strange was ever supposed to happen to a girl like me. I sold real estate. I drank my coffee black. I had a husband who remembered our anniversary and brought home flowers for no reason, and laughed at my jokes even when they weren't funny. Dean Whitfield was, by every visible measure, a good husband. Our friends called us the perfect couple. My mother called him a keeper. What none of them knew was that I had spent 3 years of my marriage watching a golden thread stretch from my husband's chest toward a horizon I couldn't name. I had learned, over 2 decades of seeing what no one else could see, that the threads never lied. They didn't care about wedding vows or shared mortgages or the life 2 people built together. They simply showed where 2 souls were always going to end up, whether the people attached to them liked it or not. I had built my entire adult life around ignoring a truth that hung in plain sight every single day. That ended on a Tuesday night in October, when Dean told me he was working late at the office, and I looked down at his thread on his way out the door and noticed, for the first time in 3 years, that it was pulling taut, urgent, close. I had never seen it do that before. So when his car pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my keys and followed the only thing I had ever trusted more than him. His thread. The thread led me 11 miles across town, past the freeway exit Dean always claimed was the fastest route to his office, into a part of the city I had no reason to ever visit. It stopped at a brick apartment building, with ivy crawling up one side and warm light glowing behind a 3rd-floor window. I parked across the street and sat there with my hands locked around the steering wheel, watching the golden line stretch from my husband's parked car all the way up to that window, steady and glowing. More solid than I had ever seen it. I had spent 3 years telling myself the threads could be wrong. Looking at that window, I understood I had never actually believed that. I had just needed time to be brave enough to act on what I already knew. I got out of the car. The lobby door was propped open with a folded newspaper, the kind of small carelessness that exists only in buildings where everyone already knows everyone. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heels silent on the worn carpet, until I reached the 3rd floor and found the door the thread disappeared beneath. I didn't knock right away. I stood there listening. I heard Dean's voice first, low and warm in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. Then a woman's laugh, easy and familiar, the kind of laugh that only comes from comfort built over time, not a first encounter. This wasn't new. This was practiced. My hand was shaking when I finally knocked. The voices stopped. Footsteps approached. The door opened, and Dean stood there in a shirt I didn't recognize, half untucked, his face draining of color so fast I almost felt sorry for him. Behind him, sitting on the arm of a gray couch with a glass of wine in her hand, was a woman I had never seen before in my life, but I recognized her instantly anyway, because the golden thread running from her chest connected to the exact same place his did. "Vivian," Dean said, his voice cracking around my name like it had forgotten how to hold it. "This isn't what it looks like." I looked past him at the woman on the couch, who hadn't moved, who was watching me with an expression that wasn't shock at all. It was recognition. "You can see it too?" I said. It wasn't a question. The woman set down her wine glass slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. "Since I was 7, she said. and I've been staring at your husband's thread for the past 6 months, wondering when you'd finally follow it here." What I hadn't expected, standing in that doorway with my marriage collapsing in real time, was that the next sentence out of her mouth would have nothing to do with Dean at all. Her name was Margot Sinclair, and she said it like she'd been waiting to introduce herself to me for a long time. "Can we sit down?" she said. It wasn't really a question either. "There's something you need to understand, and Dean isn't the one who should explain it." Dean tried to speak. Margot held up a hand without even looking at him, and he went quiet, which told me more about their 6 months together than anything else could have. I sat on the edge of an armchair across from her, my coat still buttoned, my purse still in my lap, every instinct telling me to run, and every other instinct telling me to stay, until I understood exactly what I was looking at. "I've seen the threads since I was a kid, too," Margot said. "I thought I was losing my mind until I met someone in college who saw them too." She told me something nobody ever tells you about this gift. The thread shows you where two souls end up. It doesn't tell you why, and it doesn't tell you when. "I don't need a lecture about my own husband's thread," I said. "You're not understanding me," Margot said, leaning forward. "I'm not talking about my thread to Dean." She turned her wrist over, slow and deliberate, and pulled back the sleeve of her sweater. A second thread ran along the inside of her arm, fainter than the one connecting her to Dean, almost silver instead of gold. It trailed off her fingertips and out toward the window, toward the street, toward something beyond the building entirely. "I have 2, she said quietly. "I've had 2 since I was 17. Nobody talks about that part. Sometimes the gift shows you more than one connection, and you spend your whole life trying to figure out which one is real and which one is a distraction sent to keep you from the truth." Dean was staring at her arm like he'd never seen it before either. "You never told me that," he said. "You never asked what my life was like before you," Margot said, not unkindly, but with the exhaustion of someone repeating an old argument. "You just followed your thread to me and assumed that meant I belonged to you." I sat very still, processing what she'd just handed me. If threads could fork, if they could mislead, if they could point toward something temporary instead of something true, then everything I had spent 3 years believing about Dean's thread might not mean what I thought it meant. But there was a colder thought underneath that one, and it took my breath when it landed. If Margot had 2 threads, maybe I did too. I had only ever followed the one connected to Dean. I had spent 26 years assuming I understood my own gift completely. I had never once turned my attention inward to check my own chest for a second line I might have missed. "I need to see something," I said, standing up abruptly. Margot watched me with an unreadable expression. "See what?" "My own thread," I said. "I've never actually looked." I walked to the mirror hanging beside Margot's front door, my hands trembling as I unbuttoned my coat and looked down at my own chest for the first time in my entire life with the deliberate intention of really seeing what was there. What I found made every certainty I had ever built my marriage on collapse at once. There were 2 threads, one gold, thick and old, running straight toward Dean, exactly where it had always been, exactly where I expected it. But beside it, fainter, newer, was a second thread I had never noticed because I had never once looked for it. Silver, like Margot's. It trailed away from my chest, out through the apartment wall, into the night, toward a direction I had no way of identifying just by looking at it. "Oh," Margot said softly, watching my face. "You have 2 as well." Dean stepped closer, staring at my chest, like he could somehow see what we were seeing, though I knew he couldn't. He had never had the gift. That had always been my secret, mine alone, until this exact moment. "What does that mean?" he asked. And for the first time since I'd opened that door, his voice sounded less like a man caught and more like a man genuinely afraid of an answer. "It means the same thing it means for me," Margot said. "It means somewhere out there is a second possibility, a second ending to this story that none of us saw coming." I sat back down slowly, my mind racing through 26 years of certainty I had never questioned. I had built every belief about love and fate and inevitability on the assumption that each person had exactly one thread, one destiny, one soul they were bound to find. I had spent 3 miserable years tethered to a marriage I believed was simply wrong timing colliding with right fate. Now I understood I had only ever been looking at half the picture. "How do I find out where it leads?" I asked. Margot's expression shifted into something almost gentle. The same way you found this one. You follow it. But Vivian, I have to warn you about something first. What? The second thread doesn't always mean a better ending, she said. Sometimes it's harder. Sometimes the person on the other end is someone you'd never expect. Someone complicated. Someone who comes with their own threads and their own tangled history. I followed mine once. It led somewhere I wasn't ready for. Dean was watching the two of us with the look of a man slowly realizing he had walked into a conversation far bigger than his own affair, one where he was no longer the central character. Where did yours lead? I asked Margot. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for her phone, scrolled for a moment, and turned the screen toward me. A photograph, a man's face, familiar in a way that sent ice down my spine. It led to your brother, she said quietly. 3 years ago, before I ever met Dean. I stared at the screen, at my own brother's face, smiling back at me from Margot's phone, and the entire night tilted sideways into something I had no idea how to navigate. I stared at the photo until the screen dimmed on its own. That's not possible, I said. You're telling me you have a thread to my brother and a thread to my husband at the same time. I told you, Margot said, setting the phone face down on the couch cushion beside her. Nobody explains the second thread to you. I spent 2 years thinking I was broken because I had feelings pulling me in 2 directions that weren't supposed to coexist. Then I met your brother at a gallery opening in Seattle. We dated for 4 months. It ended badly. I never told him why I left. Why did you leave? Because the thread to him went quiet, she said. It happens sometimes. A thread can dim if the timing isn't right, if one person isn't ready, if too much stands between 2 people for the universe to push them together yet. Mine dimmed 3 weeks after we started dating. Around the same time, Dean's thread to me started getting brighter. Dean had gone very pale, sitting now in a kitchen chair he'd pulled from somewhere, looking like a man watching his own life get rewritten in real time by 2 women comparing notes about a gift he could neither see nor understand. So you switched, I said, like changing lanes. It's not a choice, Margot said, an edge entering her voice for the first time. I didn't decide to stop loving your brother. The connection faded on its own, and a different one got stronger. I don't control which thread is loudest. I just notice when something shifts. I thought about my own silver thread, faint and unexplored, trailing out through the wall into a night I knew nothing about. If threads could dim and brighten depending on circumstances neither person controlled, then my marriage to Dean wasn't simply a mistake I'd made by ignoring a warning sign. It was something more complicated. A gold thread that had never been my only path, sitting beside a silver one I'd never bothered to notice because I'd assumed, my entire life, that one thread meant one truth. I need to call my brother, I said. Vivian, wait. Margot stood up fast. There's something else you should know before you do that. What now? She hesitated, glancing at Dean, then back at me, choosing her next words with visible care. Your brother has been engaged for 2 months, she said. To someone whose thread I've seen, and it doesn't lead to him. I felt the floor tilt again. Whose thread is it? I asked, though some instinct already knew I wasn't going to like the answer, the same instinct that had driven me into this apartment in the first place. Margot looked at me steadily. It leads to you. The room went silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator in Margot's kitchen. That's not possible, I said again, though I was beginning to understand that everything I'd believed wasn't possible kept turning out to be exactly what was happening tonight. I don't even know my brother's fiancée. I've met her twice. Her name is Tessa, Margot said. And I noticed her thread the second time I ever saw her, at your brother's birthday dinner in March. I didn't say anything because what was I supposed to say? Hi, I dated your fiancé, and also your future sister-in-law's soul thread points at someone in this family, but not him. Dean finally spoke, his voice hoarse. This is insane. You're talking about strings that don't exist. They exist, I said, sharper than I meant to. You've watched my eyes flick toward things you couldn't see for 3 years and never once asked why. He had no answer for that. I pulled out my phone, my hands steadier now than they'd been all night, and found my brother's number. Margot reached out and gently pushed the phone back down before I could press call. Not tonight, she said. Not like this. You're standing in another woman's apartment at 11 at night, having just discovered your husband's affair and the fact that you have a second thread you've never followed. If you call your brother right now, you're going to say something you can't take back, about a thread connecting his fiancée to someone without even knowing who that someone is yet. She was right, and I hated that she was right. Then who is it? I asked. If you've seen Tessa's thread, you know where it goes. Margot's expression turned careful in a way I was starting to recognize as her version of breaking bad news gently. I don't know the person's name, she said. I only saw the thread itself, the direction it pulled. It led toward this building, toward this floor. The air left my lungs. You're saying Tessa's thread leads here, I said slowly. To this apartment. I'm saying it led to this floor, Margot said. And there are only 2 units on this floor, Vivian. Mine, and the one across the hall. Dean's head turned slowly toward the door, toward the wall separating Margot's apartment from her neighbor's, his face shifting from shock into something closer to recognition. That's strange, he said quietly. I've met the guy across the hall a couple times when I came by. Tessa actually mentioned him once, said they went to college together. I didn't think anything of it. I looked at the shared wall, then at Margot, then at my own silver thread still trailing faintly out through it into the night. 3 threads, 1 floor, 1 building none of us had any reason to be standing in tonight, except that apparently we'd all been pulled here for months without realizing it. I think, Margot said slowly, we need to knock on that door. Margot crossed the apartment before I could stop her and opened her own front door, stepping into the hallway barefoot. Dean and I followed, the 3 of us standing in the dim corridor like conspirators in something none of us had planned. She knocked on the door across the hall. It took almost a minute before it opened. A man stood there in sweatpants and a faded college sweatshirt, maybe 30, with the startled look of someone who hadn't expected visitors at 11 at night. His eyes moved from Margot to Dean to me, confused, then landed on me and stayed there a beat too long. Can I help you? He asked carefully. I'm sorry to bother you, Margot said. This is going to sound strange. Do you know someone named Tessa? His expression shifted instantly, guarded now. Why are you asking me that? Because I think you should know she's engaged, I said. He went very still. I know she's engaged. We went to college together. We're friends. Are you sure that's all it is? Margot asked gently. He didn't answer right away, and the silence told me more than any answer could have. I watched his eyes drop briefly to his own chest, an instinctive, unconscious motion, the exact same gesture I'd made an hour earlier, in front of Margot's mirror. You can see them too, I said quietly. Can't you? His head snapped up. See what? The threads. He didn't deny it. He just stood there in his doorway, his hand tightening slightly on the frame, looking at the 3 strangers who had somehow shown up outside his apartment, speaking a language he'd spent his whole life thinking only he understood. Who are you people? He finally asked, though it came out softer than the question deserved. My name is Vivian, I said. This is my husband, Dean, and I think your friend Tessa might be about to marry the wrong man for the 2nd time tonight. His name was Julian Cross, and he invited us in, though I suspected later it was less hospitality and more the desperate need of a man who'd been carrying a secret alone for years and had just been handed 3 strangers who finally understood it. We sat in his small living room, the 4 of us, while Julian explained that he'd seen his thread to Tessa since the day they met freshman year. He'd never told her. She'd started dating my brother 8 months ago. He'd watched the engagement happen from across the hall of a building he'd specifically chosen because it happened to be close to where she worked, close enough to remain in her orbit without ever crossing a line he'd convinced himself didn't matter. I never said anything, Julian said. Because what was I supposed to say? My invisible string says we're meant to be, so leave the guy who actually asked you to marry him? I understood that hesitation better than anyone in the room. I did the opposite, I said. I saw my thread, and married the wrong man anyway, because I was too scared to trust what I couldn't explain to anyone else. Julian looked at me for a long moment. So what do we do now? He asked. 4 people standing in a room full of threads pointing everywhere except where any of us are standing. Nobody answered him right away. Dean was the one who finally broke the silence, and what he said surprised all of us, myself included. I think the 4 of us need to stop deciding things at midnight, he said quietly. I think Tessa needs to know what Julian feels, and I think Vivian's brother deserves the truth too, whatever that truth turns out to be. But none of this gets fixed standing in a stranger's living room at midnight, making each other more afraid than we already are. It was the most reasonable thing I'd heard all night, and it came from the man I'd spent 3 years convinced I understood completely. We agreed to wait until morning. Margot offered her couch. Dean went home alone, to the house we shared, the first night in 3 years I hadn't gone with him, and neither of us pretended that was anything other than what it was. The next morning I called my brother, Holt, and asked him to meet me for coffee. I didn't tell him why over the phone. Some things needed a face for the telling. He arrived looking exactly like a man who suspected something was wrong and didn't know what. I told him everything. The threads, Dean, Margot, Julian across the hall. I watched his expressions cycle through disbelief, anger, confusion, and finally, something quieter. Something that looked almost like relief. The particular relief of a man who'd been quietly uneasy about something for months without having language for it. I knew something felt off, he admitted. Tessa gets a certain look whenever Julian's name comes up. I told myself I was imagining it. You weren't imagining it, I said. Holt sat with that for a long time, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table between us. What do I do? He finally asked. Marry someone whose heart might belong somewhere else? Or call off a wedding 3 months out because of a string my sister can see and I can't? I can't answer that for you, I said. I spent 3 years answering that question wrong for myself. I'm not going to pretend I have it figured out now. He nodded slowly, and I watched him decide something behind his eyes before he said it out loud. I need to talk to Tessa, he said. Tonight. I didn't go with him. Some conversations only work with 2 people in the room. I went home instead, to the house Dean and I shared, and found him sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee already poured, one across from him, waiting for me before I'd even arrived. I think we need to talk too, he said. I sat down across from him, my silver thread still faint and unexplored, trailing somewhere beyond the kitchen window, into a future neither of us could see yet. And for the first time in 3 years, I let myself actually look at him instead of past him. I'm not going to pretend the last 3 years made sense, Dean said, both hands wrapped around his coffee mug like it was the only steady thing in the room. I think some part of me always knew something was missing. I just didn't have a name for it the way you did. You knew Margot's thread led to you, I said. Did you know mine never did? He flinched, but he didn't look away. I suspected. The way you'd sometimes look at me, like you were checking something, instead of just seeing me. I told myself it was nothing. I think I needed it to be nothing, because the alternative meant admitting our whole marriage might have started on a misunderstanding neither of us caused. I thought about that for a long moment. 26 years of watching threads connect strangers, and somehow I had never once considered that being wrong about a marriage didn't make either person a villain. It just made us 2 people who'd built something real out of a connection that was never going to last forever, regardless of how hard either of us tried. I'm not angry at you for Margot, I said, and meant it more than I expected to. I think I've been waiting 3 years for permission to stop pretending. You just got there with someone else's help instead of your own honesty. We agreed to separate that week, not with bitterness, with the quiet, mutual exhaustion of 2 people finally putting down something they'd been carrying wrong for years. Holt called me 2 nights later. Tessa had ended the engagement herself, before he'd even finished explaining what he'd learned. She told him she'd been feeling the same uncertain pull toward Julian for months, and had been too afraid to say it out loud. The exact same fear that had kept me silent in front of an altar 3 years earlier. 6 months later, I sat at a small backyard gathering Margot had organized. The kind of mismatched group of people who never should have known each other and now couldn't imagine their lives without one another. Holt was there with Tessa, the 2 of them no longer engaged but somehow easier together than I'd ever seen them, friendship settling into something honest now that the pressure was gone. Julian sat near them, quieter, patient, his thread to Tessa still faint but steady, a future neither of them had rushed toward yet. I hadn't followed my own silver thread. Not yet. Some nights I caught myself wondering where it led, watching it trail faintly out past the porch lights into a darkness I wasn't ready to chase. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of not knowing. I had spent 26 years believing the threads decided everything, that my only job was to follow wherever they pointed and call it fate. Standing in that backyard, watching people slowly choosing honesty over certainty, I understood something the threads had never been able to teach me. They could show me where two souls might meet. But what we did once we got there had always been up to us.